Have you ever gone into a training session that on paper you know you're capable of? Maybe it's weights and reps or paces and distances that you've done before, but then for no apparent reason, your performance just crashes midway through. Like you're looking at a slight progression from last week's session that should be doable because last week you felt switched on, strong, you were moving well, you were pushing the pace, but then you go into an almost identical session just a week later and you feel like a completely different person. Everything feels heavy and slow, you're out of breath way sooner than you'd expect, you're struggling to focus, and you're thinking, what the hell is wrong with me today? Nothing obvious has changed. You slept roughly the same, you trained at a similar time of day, you're not more fatigued from the last few days of training. You just feel like you've regressed overnight. If this situation feels at all familiar, this episode is for you because all too often I see athletes who are consistent with their sleep, their training routine, their ability to push themselves, and maybe they're even consistent with their calorie intake, but there is a key piece missing that sabotages how consistent they're able to be in their training sessions, no matter how hard they try. And that is a consistent and effective pre-training fueling strategy. And this isn't just for people who feel inconsistent in their training sessions, this is for anyone who trains hard and cares about performance and getting the most out of their training sessions. Because even if you think that your current pre-workout fueling strategy or lack thereof is working just fine, what if you could unlock another level of performance without needing to work harder just by being smarter about your fueling? And before you switch off thinking, I don't want to hear another person telling me how to eat perfectly or telling me exactly what I need to eat before training, or even that I don't want to eat before training, that is not what this episode is about. By the end of this episode, you are going to understand exactly what pre-workout nutrition is for, why so many people get it wrong without realizing, and why copying your favorite influencers' pre-workout banana and peanut butter is stopping you from getting the most out of your training. I am not going to be giving you rigid rules, exact gram targets, or meals that you need to eat. I'm going to be giving you the ability to understand exactly what fuel your body needs and why, so that you can go away and experiment and find what actually works best for you. So let's start with what pre-workout nutrition is actually supposed to do when it's done right. Because how can we build a fueling strategy if we don't know exactly what we're trying to achieve? First and foremost, pre-workout nutrition is simply about making sure your body has the energy to do what you're asking it to do during that training session. It's not about eating clean or trying to hack fat burning, and it's not even about trying to get as much fuel on board as possible. It's about energy availability and matching your intake with your output. Because if you consider that how many calories your body needs can vary day to day depending on your activity levels, this is actually the case because your body's energy needs are varying throughout the day, hour by hour, and minute by minute. So of course, during the time you're training, whether that's lifting, CrossFit, high rocks, running, or any other form of high effort exercise, you're asking your body to produce force, sustain intensity, coordinate movement, and even recover between efforts. And all of that is a lot of work. It's incredibly energy demanding. So of course, your body needs more energy here than it does at other times of the day, like for example, when you're sitting down. So rather than spreading your food intake, aka your energy intake, evenly across the day, you want to be giving your body a higher proportion of that energy intake when it needs it most. And that's going to be around training, including, of course, before training. And this is where that inconsistency in how you feel during your training sessions that we talked about at the start of the episode comes in. Even if you think you're being consistent with your nutrition because you're eating the same number of calories and maybe even macros each day. Because if one day you happen to have enough fuel on board before training, you happen to eat the right things at the right times, in the right amounts, just by chance, the session feels great. But then the next day, without consciously doing anything differently, even though you ate the same total calories across the day, energy availability is lower for your training session and everything feels harder than it should. So you've got this situation where you've got the same athlete, the same fitness level, the same total fuel across the day, but the difference is whether the fuel was there when it was needed. And that energy availability is the difference between feeling flat, losing focus, and hitting a wall during training versus being able to actually express the strength and fitness that you have, being able to keep pushing during a session, and even stay focused because your brain actually needs energy too. And the positive impact that pre-workout nutrition can have on your long-term progress goes well beyond fueling each individual session. Because even I get it wrong sometimes, I'll mistime my pre-workout fuel, or maybe I will misjudge exactly how much I need. But the overall impact is far more important. It's about the compounding effect of being consistently fueled each session, because that is what allows you to progress fastest. When you can go into each training session with predictable energy levels, this is going to mean that you're much more able to stick to a structured, progressive overload-based training plan and go into each session knowing how you're going to feel, not hoping that you feel okay. And if you can get more out of each training session, then that is going to add up a lot over time. And sometimes, yes, you can get through a session without fueling properly or even at all, but getting through a session and getting the most out of it are two very different things, because you can't outwork a physiological lack of fuel, no matter how disciplined or how strong-willed you are. It is also worth saying here that fueling your training, including pre-workout nutrition, doesn't exist in a vacuum. It sits within the bigger picture of your overall daily nutrient intake, your training load and goals, and what nutrition phase you're in, whether that's fat loss, maintenance, a surplus. But regardless of the phase you're in, the role of pre-workout nutrition stays the same, to support performance, consistency, and quality of training. So if pre-workout nutrition as a concept all seems pretty logical, why are people still getting things so wrong? Why is it that people will eat their pre-workout fuel, but then they'll feel bloated or sluggish? Why is it that people can eat carbs before their session, but still run out of gas halfway through? And why is it that some people swear that they feel their best when they train fasted, even though this goes completely against the idea of maximizing energy availability? There are several reasons, and I want to talk about the 3 most common practical mistakes I see, and then we'll get into exactly how to avoid these mistakes so that you can start nailing your pre-workout fueling. So the first one is really simple. It is a mismatch between how much energy you need for a specific session versus how much energy you're taking on board. And most commonly, this looks like underfueling, but it can go the other way sometimes too. So think of it like this. You know what your session's going to be, how long it is, whether it's strength, conditioning, endurance, intervals, whatever, but you're not thinking about it in terms of what that means for the session's total energy demands. A session feeling really heavy, like maxing out your squat, doesn't necessarily mean a high energy expenditure compared to, say, doing 60 minutes of easy, low intensity, continuous cardio, even though psychologically that feels easier and far less demanding on your nervous system. Your body needs more energy, aka calories, to do that cardio session. So underfueling happens when people underestimate how much they need to take on board to get through their session, especially if that session is longer and/or more intense. And it happens when people don't prioritize fueling before training because maybe they prefer to eat more calories elsewhere in the day. And that is absolutely fine, but you need to acknowledge and be aware of that trade-off and how it's impacting your performance, your recovery, and even your body composition. And fasted training naturally falls into this underfueling category in the most extreme sense. And it's an ideal time to again raise the point that just because you feel fine doesn't mean you're anywhere near fueled properly, especially if you just feel fine because that's what you're used to. Like, our bodies are very good at adapting. So if you've always trained fasted, you will adapt to a level where that just feels like your baseline, but that baseline of performance is far lower than your actual potential. And then, as I mentioned, this mismatch between fueling and energy demands can go the other way, where you're eating more than you need, which can cause you to feel bloated or give you digestive issues, or it can just leave you with less fuel at other times of the day, where your energy demands might be lower, but you do still need nutrients to keep going. So getting your pre-workout nutrition right isn't just about eating as much as you can before training, it's about aligning it properly with what your body actually needs. So that's mistake number 1, a mismatch between the amount of fuel you're taking on and the amount you actually need. Now, the next 2 mistakes almost always go hand in hand, and they explain why so many people say things like, well, I ate before training, but I felt awful, or I tried pre-workout nutrition and it just doesn't sit right with me. And those 2 mistakes are poor timing and choosing foods that don't match that timing. Because what you eat and when you eat it are inseparable. You can eat the right foods, but at the wrong time, and they won't help you. Or you can eat at the right time, but choose foods that digest way too slowly or too quickly, and again, they also won't help you. For example, someone eats a solid, balanced meal, carbs, protein, fats, fiber, which is a great meal, but they eat it an hour before training and then they feel heavy, bloated, and sluggish during their session. And instead of thinking that the problem was, well, the meal just didn't have time to digest, they come to the conclusion that they just can't eat before training, or they're just someone who trains better fasted. When really the issue was not eating itself, it was eating the wrong thing for the time window that they were eating in. On the flip side, you've got people who eat far enough away from training that slow digestion isn't the issue. Rather, the issue is that they've digested, absorbed, and used a lot of the fuel from that meal before they've even started training, because maybe the meal was too small, or it was too fast digesting, or maybe just too far away from training. So by the time they're midway through their session, which could be hours later, they're running out of gas, even though they technically ate before training. And then they end up thinking, oh, well, I don't really understand what the hype around carbs is. They didn't really make a difference for me. or they just think, oh, that session was hard today, and they don't realize that there was a clear, fixable reason. When in reality, the problem was, again, a mismatch with the type of food they ate and the time window that they ate it in. And this is also where a lot of generic advice just falls apart. Like, I remember a banana and peanut butter was the pre-workout go-to back when I was first getting into fitness and using Tumblr Fitspo as my go-to source, which I'm so glad we've moved out of that era now. You know, generic advice like people saying that you need complex carbs or other people saying you need sugary carbs, or that you'll feel some sort of zen flow state when you train fasted. Because none of that generic advice accounts for how long before training you're eating, how demanding the session is, and how quickly you personally digest and absorb food. So if you've ever tried something once, not felt great as a result, and written off pre-workout fueling altogether, what I want you to take from this is that when pre-workout nutrition doesn't work, it's not because the concept of fueling is wrong, it's because the approach or strategy is wrong, which brings us to the next step, understanding exactly what your body uses as fuel and why certain nutrients matter more or less depending on how close you are to training. And it's this understanding that will give you the ability to effortlessly adapt your workout nutrition to suit you in any scenario, whether you're training first thing in the morning or late in the evening. So the nutrient that you probably hear the most about when it comes to fuel, and rightly so, is carbohydrates. Carbs are your best friend when it comes to pre-workout nutrition, because if you're doing any sort of high intensity activity, whether it's cardio based, strength and power based, or hybrid training, your body needs lots of energy and it needs it quickly. And the nutrient it's able to break down and turn into energy fastest is carbohydrates. So if you're interested in being able to keep up your pace in training, push more reps, or maintain intensity further into your session rather than drop off a cliff, you need carbs. And eating them before training is the equivalent of filling your car's fuel tank. You want to fill it with enough fuel to get you through the whole session, and you want to fill it with the right type of fuel. Carbs do the heavy lifting when it comes to pre-workout nutrition, but they don't work alone. So let's talk about the other macro that gets a lot of attention when it comes to performance nutrition, protein. And protein is actually something that can cause a lot of confusion when it comes to pre-workout fuel, because you likely know it's essential for building muscle and supporting recovery, so it feels logical to assume that more protein before training must mean better performance. But protein isn't a primary fuel source. Your body doesn't use protein to produce a quick supply of energy in the same way that it does with carbs. So eating protein before training isn't about feeling more energized in the session itself. Instead, protein plays more of a supportive role. It helps reduce muscle breakdown during training, which can potentially be even more important for longer training sessions or if you're in a calorie deficit. It supports recovery afterwards, and it contributes to your overall daily protein intake, which absolutely matters for long-term progress. Of course, if you want to know more about protein's role in your diet overall, I've got an entire episode dedicated to protein, which I'll link below, so make sure you check that out if you've got protein questions. But within pre-workout nutrition specifically, protein is important, but it's not the thing that's going to make or break how energized you feel in a session. It's there to support the work you're doing, not to fuel it directly. The last macronutrient that we need to talk about is fats. Fats are an essential part of your diet for hormone health, nutrient absorption, appetite regulation, and long-term energy balance. But when it comes to pre-workout nutrition, fats are very much timing dependent. And this is because fats digest slowly. And that's not a bad thing. In fact, it's one of the things that makes fats so useful to eat at other times of the day when you want to feel fuller for longer. But slow digestion means that energy availability from the food you're eating is slowed down. And that doesn't just apply to how fast you can digest the fats you're eating, it also affects how quickly you're able to digest and absorb nutrients from other foods, including your essential carb sources. Another important thing to mention with fats is that they are actually an energy source themselves, the densest energy source in fat, containing 9 calories per gram versus 4 calories per gram of carbohydrates. But that doesn't make them the best energy source for training, because it's not just digesting fats that is a slow process. The process of converting the fats that you've digested into usable energy is also very slow. Too slow to support sustaining high intensity levels. So all of this means that fats can have a place in your pre-workout meal when there's plenty of time before a session, but when time is tight, they are going to be a hindrance, not a help. Now, before we move on to the next piece, which is getting more specific with timing these nutrients, there is one final piece of the puzzle that tends to get overlooked when it comes to pre-workout fueling, and that is fiber. Fiber is technically a carbohydrate, but it's a type of carbohydrate that we can't digest. So it behaves very differently and has a very different role to the carbs that your body uses for energy that we talked about earlier. And just like fats, fiber slows digestion, which is why I wanted to talk about it here. So fiber has a ton of health benefits, like keeping you fuller for longer, regulating blood sugar, and supporting digestion and gut health. But because of its effects on digestion, just like fats, timing is key if you want to avoid the feeling of food just sitting there in your stomach during training, or even feeling gassy or bloated or needing the bathroom at very inopportune moments. And when people say things like, I can't eat carbs before training, what they really mean is that they probably ate high fiber carbs too close to training once and they didn't feel great for it. And so we've talked about carbs, we've talked about protein, fats, and fiber, how none of them are inherently good or bad. They all have their own important roles for health and performance. And I've alluded to the fact that what matters most when it comes to deciding what to eat is how close you are to your session and how quickly your body needs access to that fuel. So now it's time to bring this all together into a simple timing framework that you can use in real life, whether you're needing to fuel 3 hours before or 30 minutes before your training session. And so the simplest way to do this is to think of pre-workout nutrition as a timeline that basically acts as a sliding scale, not a set of hard and fast rules. And at one end of this timeline, we are immediately pre-workout within 30 minutes of training. And on the other end of this timeline, we're 2 to 3 hours, sometimes a little bit longer from training. Now, the closer you are to your training session, the simpler, faster digesting, and lower in fat and fiber your food needs to be. You don't have time to digest fats or fiber. You don't want anything to sit in your digestive system feeling heavy. You want something that's going to maximize the speed and ease at which you can get energy on board. And as you get further away from training, you've got more flexibility to include slower digesting foods like fats and fiber because your body has time to digest, absorb, and actually use that fuel. And in fact, further from training, you want to utilize these foods. Otherwise, you can end up in a position where you've taken on a load of fast digesting carbs, spiked your blood sugar, and now you're on the other side of that spike going into training feeling tired and potentially hungry too. So rather than thinking in terms of what foods are good or bad before training, I want you to start thinking in terms of where am I on that sliding scale and what foods will fuel me best based on that. And just before I walk you through that sliding scale in more detail, I want to remind you that these are general guidelines, and how quickly we digest and absorb food varies between people and can even vary within one individual depending on other factors such as hormones or stress. So consider this as a starting point, and we're going to tie it together at the end with a practical experiment for you to put into action this week. Let's start at the end of the scale that is furthest from training. And I typically put this around 3 hours before training because really, if you're eating much longer before training than that, it's not really a pre-workout meal. It is just a meal, right? And I'd say you're going to need to top up with something, even if it's a smaller snack, closer to your session if that is the case. But let's say you're having your pre-workout meal 3 hours before training. This is where you have the most flexibility and you can eat a proper balanced meal. Carbs, protein, fats, and fiber, because you've got plenty of time to digest it. When you're this far from training, you want your carbs to be more complex and higher in fiber. Think fruit, whole grains, and maybe some veg, so that they give you a sustained release of energy that lasts up until your session. You want a decent serving of protein, so whatever you'd have at your typical meals to help spread your protein intake evenly across the day. And then you want a moderate serving of healthy fats. These will help keep you full so you're not hungry by the time you're warming up. Plus, they'll help you absorb all the micronutrients from your meal and contribute to your essential fat intake for the day as well. So this is where proper balanced breakfasts, lunches, or dinners fit really well. But typically you want to be increasing the amount of carbs in your portion compared to if it was a non-training meal, like on a rest day, or like your morning meal when you're training in the evening. So then as you move closer to training, let's say we're now eating 1 to 2 hours before training, this is where you're going to need to get a little bit more aware of what type of carbs you're eating and be more mindful of fat and fiber intake. At this point, carbs are very much front and center, but instead of complex high fiber carbs like whole grains or even vegetables, you're shifting towards more simple carbs or a combination of simple and complex carbs. And I'm talking about a 1 to 2 hour time window here. But that sliding scale means, of course, that towards the 1 hour end of the time window, you're going even more simple with your carbs. And towards the 2 hour end of that time window, you're maybe still leaning more towards complex carbs. You'll want to include protein in this time window too, but make sure it is a lean protein source because this is the point where you're also going to want to be reducing fats to avoid slowing digestion. So high carbs coming from a mix of simple and complex sources, moderate protein, and lower fats and fiber, but not completely zero on the fats and fiber. Now, as you move closer to training again into the 30 to 60 minutes before training window, you'll want to make some more shifts. Carbs are the focus here, and you're going to want them to be very much on the simpler, lower fiber end. Things like white bread, sugary cereals, and certain fruits like very ripe bananas or tin fruits that don't have the peel, because the peel is the very high fiber part. Basically, the priority is getting carbs on board from foods that you'll be able to digest ready for training. Protein here is going to depend exactly on how close you are to training and also how well you tolerate it. So a protein shake can be a great option, particularly whey, because it's fast digesting, but it's not a necessity, especially for shorter sessions and also if you've had plenty of protein already in the last 3 to 4 hours. And when you're this close to training, fats and fiber should be kept minimal because they're only going to slow digestion and potentially cause GI distress. And finally, if you're fueling within 30 minutes of training, the goal is pretty much to get the easiest digesting fuel on board that you can, which means liquid carbs like fruit juice or carb supplements, or other sugary, fast digesting foods like sweets, alongside hydration, which aids digestion and of course is essential in its own right for your performance. Fats and fiber will be 0, and if you want to, you could include a whey protein shake, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in next week's episode on intra-workout nutrition, so make sure you're following or subscribed so you don't miss it. So whilst the range of different foods that you could eat and the way people talk about pre-workout fueling can feel confusing, if we strip it back to this guiding principle of having a pre-workout fueling timeline, it starts to feel a lot more simple, logical, and also much more flexible. In short, closer to training, you want sugary, easy to digest, simple carbs to get energy quickly, whereas further from training, you want more complex carbs for a steady drip feed of energy. Fats and fiber slow digestion, so they'll be minimal right before training and higher the further you are from training. And protein has a supportive role. So ideally, you'll want some in the hours before training, but if it's closer to training, you'll want to consider how easily you digest and tolerate it, which might take some experimentation and practice. And this sliding scale applies whether you train in the morning, at lunch, or in the evening. It applies whether you're in a fat loss phase or at maintenance or in a surplus. The amount of fuel might change depending on your goals and the session, but the principles stayed the same. And once you understand that, pre-workout nutrition stops being confusing and becomes something that you can adapt effortlessly no matter what your day or training schedule looks like. So before we wrap up, I want to give you something practical to do with all of this, because understanding it is one thing, but that's useless if you don't know where to start with putting it into practice and actually feeling the difference for yourself. So here's what I want you to do now. Pick one small change to make to your pre-workout fueling and commit to trialing it for your next 3 training sessions. It could be your fuel timing. You might eat a bit closer to or further from your training session than you usually would. It could be how much you eat. It could be what you eat, whether that's changing the proportions of carbs, fats, and protein that you're eating, or changing the type of carbs to be more complex or more simple. It could be just fueling at all if you're used to training fasted. And if that is you, start small. Don't try and go from nothing to a full meal in one go, because you'll probably just feel uncomfortable and bloated in your session and end up writing off pre-workout fuel all over again. And with this exercise, I want you to make sure you're just changing one thing at a time. So don't go changing the timing, the amounts, and the types of foods all in one go. Otherwise, you won't be able to tell what's had what effect. Pick one thing, and after each session, reflect on your energy levels, focus, and performance, including how well you were able to sustain intensity throughout the session, and of course, any digestive symptoms. And it's important that you commit to this small change for 3 sessions, because we all have day-to-day fluctuations that are going to affect all of those outcomes that you're reflecting on, and you don't want to write something off just because you happen to have a bad training session the first time you tried it. So that is your first step, one small change practiced over 3 sessions. Once the results are in, you're going to pick another thing to experiment with and repeat the process. And this is not about trying to find one single perfect pre-workout meal. It is about learning what actually works best for you whilst being guided by the core principles we've covered today. And as you go through this process, you'll find that training starts to feel more and more predictable, repeatable, and something that you can actually build consistent progress on. Now, there is one last idea that I want to leave you with today. Even when you're nailing your pre-workout nutrition, it is still possible to feel flat, to hit a wall, and for energy and focus to dip. And if we think of pre-workout nutrition as filling the fuel tank, what happens when that fuel tank is just not big enough to get us through the journey ahead? And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about next week, when topping up your fuel during training is and isn't necessary, and how to do it. So make sure you're subscribed or following wherever you're listening. And if you want more help putting all of this together into a personalized system that adapts to your training schedule, goals, and lifestyle, including plug and play calculators that tell you exactly what to eat and when, you'll find more details about the Athlete Nutrition Blueprint and Meal Timing Mastery in the show notes. But right now, I want you to go out and test what you've learned today and let me know in the comments how you get on. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I will see you again in the next episode.